If Islam had ceased to exist 300 years ago, this country would not have lost a single thing. There is not a single good thing about our country that we would not have if not for Islam. And if you doubt that, then go ahead and give me an example of the great gift that Islam has given to this country since its founding.
Has he ever gotten off of the internet and read a book? But look, I'm happy to fill the gaps in his education. He asked me to explain what Islam or Muslims have done for America. I mean, the black Muslim slaves aside, more recently, how about the planning of the moon landings? That was a Muslim American scientist and immigrant. How about the science behind modern skyscrapers? That was a Muslim American engineer and immigrant. How about brain tumor treatment? That was a Muslim American neurosurgeon and immigrant. Just this year, the Nobel Prize for Chemistry went to, among others, a Palestinian-American Muslim immigrant whose research Matt could never possibly understand and whose work could help tackle man-made climate change, which Matt doesn't believe in.
Mehdi Hasan just dismantled Matt Walsh in a way that left no room for spin, even from Walsh's own supporters. This wasn't a back and forth or clash of opinions. It was a methodical takedown, built on facts, clarity, and pressure that Walsh never recovered from. You really need to watch this from start to finish because before I share my perspective, it's important to see just how decisively this plays out. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see who's tuned in. And if you're here for direct analysis, grounded arguments, and commentary that doesn't pull punches, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.
We need to talk about Matt Walsh. And if you're asking Matt who, then I'm truly envious of you. Normally I wouldn't waste time responding to basically an internet troll, but Matt is so emblematic of everything that is wrong with the modern MAGA right. Faux outrage, self-victimization, verbal abuse, a walking, talking Dunning-Kruger. Now, Matt Walsh, who says he's a conservative Christian, is upset with me for being a Muslim and for being an immigrant, but above all else, for being an American. That he cannot stand. So he did an entire 13-minute video calling me a spiteful, lying, self-entitled brat, on top of his tweet in which he called me an ungrateful little bitch. Just as Jesus would have said. Now, before we get into the substance of Matt's claims, if we can even call it that, before we get into what I said about Muslims and the founding of America, a little bit of background on who Matt Walsh is. Shock jock podcaster, former radio DJ, and now basically that Daily Wire guy who isn't Ben Shapiro. He's also the guy who hasn't got the greatest of political judgment. He went all in on Ron DeSantis in the GOP primary and then had to come crawling back to Trump when DeSantis got destroyed, as some of us predicted he would. Matt is also the guy who said COVID wasn't a big deal, that, quote, it's totally irrational to panic over this virus. He later admitted he got it wrong. But here's my favorite. Matt was so bothered by a black woman playing Ariel in the Little Mermaid movie that he actually said this.
From a scientific perspective, okay, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have someone with darker skin who lives deep in the ocean.
There are no words to describe how dumb you have to be to try and make scientific arguments about the skin color of mermaids, which are fictional fucking characters, Matt. This is the guy who millions on the right turn to for intellectual guidance, historical analysis, and thought leadership. Then you wonder why this country is so screwed right now. By the way, just quickly, consistency isn't really his thing either. In May of this year, he said identifying as a girl dad is super cringe and corny. In 2020, though, he said being a girl dad is a great blessing. He constantly complains about political violence and death threats when they're aimed at him, but he's happy to dish it out to the people he doesn't like. He's called for the mayor of Chicago, a black man, to be executed. He's called for Jimmy Kimmel, a comedian, to be arrested. He once said this, too.
But it is in fact true that you have to make people hurt. And I'm sorry, but holding signs and yelling loudly will not make anyone hurt.
You have to make people hurt. Now, what's really bothering him about me is that I said in a recent visit to Dearborn,
I think that if you can play church bells, you can pray the call to prayer.
Isn't it okay for Muslim Americans to broadcast a call to prayer? I mean, let me add right now, within reason, of course, and in accordance with all local sound and noise ordinances. But Matt went nuts and said Christianity built this country. Islam did not at all in even the slightest way. That's why we can have our church bells. To which I responded, 1 in 3 of the slaves who built this country were Muslims. They were here long before the Walsh family arrived. You'd know that if you'd studied history, but I know MAGA has an issue with studying. To which Matt responded with a 13-minute video in which he got really mad, but was unable to rebut the 2 central points that I made. Number 1, enslaved people helped build this country. And number 2, perhaps up to 1 in 3 of those slaves were Muslims. Matt can't rebut that because it's true, according to historians, according to the African American History Museum, according to the US State Department. Muslim slaves are a historical fact, as his boss Ben Shapiro has famously declaimed, "Facts don't care about your feelings, Matt. It's not my fault if they didn't teach you about slavery in high school." In his video, Matt Walsh sounds like a Monty Python sketch. What did the slaves ever do for us? Ignoring the railways, the roads, the ports, the literal seat of our government, the White House and the Capitol, all built by enslaved people. And 1 in 3 of them, remember, being Muslims, black African Muslims. Matt is also just completely clueless about the Muslims who fought in the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812, in the Civil War, where most of them fought in the Union Army. But then again, Matt's been pictured wearing a Confederate t-shirt, so maybe he's mad that the Muslims fought against the Confederacy. He even issues this challenge to me.
If Islam had ceased to exist 300 years ago, this country would not have lost a single thing. There is not a single good thing about our country that we would not have if not for Islam. And if you doubt that, then go ahead and give me an example of the great gift that Islam has given to this country since its founding.
Has he never heard of the Golden Age of Islam, which helped fuel the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in Europe, which of course then helped produce the American founding fathers? Has he ever gotten off of the internet and read a book? But look, I'm happy to fill the gaps in his education. He asked me to explain what Islam or Muslims have done for America. I mean, the black Muslim slaves aside, more recently, how about the planning of the moon landings? That was a Muslim American scientist and immigrant. How about the science behind modern skyscrapers? That was a Muslim American engineer and immigrant. How about brain tumor treatment? That was a Muslim American neurosurgeon and immigrant. Just this year, the Nobel Prize for Chemistry went to, among others, a Palestinian American Muslim immigrant whose research Matt could never possibly understand and whose work could help tackle man-made climate change, which Matt doesn't believe in. Because Matt Walsh's knowledge of science is right up there with his knowledge of history. So what does he do? The guy who can't rebut basic facts. He attacks me. He goes after me for a speech I gave nearly 2 decades ago, which I said awful, dumb, bigoted things about the gay community, about non-Muslims, which I've regretted, disowned, apologized for multiple times over the decades. He thinks it's a gotcha. But here's the problem for Matt. What I said back then are essentially Matt Walsh's views right now. Matt is an anti-gay bigot today. In fact, Matt supports a Uganda law imprisoning gay people. I don't. Matt thinks most pop music is satanic. I don't. What I stupidly said nearly 20 years ago in my 20s, Matt basically says today, aged almost 40. Oh, and if you're going to play the game of what were you saying in embarrassing videos decades ago, here's what Matt Walsh was saying in 2010.
But to all of a sudden act like this phenomenon of girls getting pregnant at a young age that we consider young, 16 or 17, to act like it's a new thing is ridiculous. It's always been that way. Girls between the ages of like 17 and 24 is when they're technically most fertile.
That's pretty gross, pretty disgusting. I think we can all agree. And also kind of creepy. A 25-year-old man telling his audience how fertile 17-year-old girls are? What is wrong with you, man? I mean, it's also ironic that the right are obsessed with smearing Muslims as child molesters and saying Islam supports child marriage, and yet here is Matt on tape saying that about 17-year-old girls, about children. So, look, to conclude, who is more American? The guy who supports free and fair elections, me, or the guy who got mad when judges locked up violent insurrectionists who tried to overturn the 2020 election, Matt Walsh? Who is more American, the guy who supports the First Amendment and free speech, me, or the guy who wants to imprison people and deport people for their speech, Matt Walsh? Who is more American, the guy who supports the United States, me, or the guy who wore a t-shirt celebrating the violent traitors of the Confederacy, Matt Walsh? Who is more American, the guy who supports religious pluralism and separation of church and state as intended by the founders, me, or the guy who wants Christian nationalism in America and proudly calls himself a theocratic fascist, Matt Walsh? Yeah, I think I've made the case that I'm much more of an American and much more of a patriotic American than you are, Matt. And you're just going to have to go whine and cry about it.
Matt Walsh isn't just mistaken. He's operating with the kind of certainty that replaces understanding with attitude and treats confidence as a substitute for evidence. That's why Mehdi Hasan's argument lands so effectively. Walsh isn't engaging to learn or clarify. He's reacting from irritation and grievance. Historical facts don't challenge him intellectually. They offend him personally. The moment the conversation introduces enslaved Muslims, black contributions, or anything that disrupts his simplified version of America's origins, he loses control, not because the information is false, but because it doesn't fit the story he insists must be protected. That's really the core of it. Walsh's issue with Mehdi isn't accuracy, it's presence. Mehdi exists outside the narrow definition Walsh has decided qualifies someone as a real American. And that's why Walsh's performance becomes so absurd when history enters the room. He talks with authority about the past, while demonstrating how little of it he actually understands. Watching him respond to basic historical facts is like watching someone argue against gravity. He raises his voice, signals outrage, and leans into theatrics, but never addresses the substance, because he can't. So instead, he pivots. He reframes factual discussion as an attack. Any acknowledgement of diversity becomes hostility toward Christianity. Any expansion of inclusion becomes an act of erasure. It's a familiar routine. Inclusion is rebranded as persecution. Equality is framed as threat. History only matters when it reinforces ego. What makes this even more telling is that Mehdi didn't present a radical claim. His point was simple. Muslims should be allowed to practice their faith in America just as Christians do. That's not controversial. That's constitutional. Yet Walsh reacts as if someone proposed outlawing churches. For someone who wraps himself in patriotic language, he seems to forget the First Amendment the moment it applies to people he dislikes. That selective reverence exposes how empty his appeals to American values really are. The hypocrisy doesn't stop there. Walsh fixates on comments Mehdi made decades ago and already addressed, while Walsh himself actively defends discriminatory laws, praises repression abroad, and traffics in rhetoric that would end most public careers instantly. He presents himself as a moral authority while recycling arguments that sound like they were pulled straight from decades-old outrage radio. Mehdi doesn't need to exaggerate or attack. He simply quotes Walsh, applies context, and lets the contradictions speak for themselves. The result is revealing. Walsh imagines himself as a guardian of civilization, yet he can't withstand basic correction without collapsing into defensiveness. Patriotism, as Mehdi demonstrates, isn't about volume or exclusion. It's about commitment to principles even when they protect people outside your comfort zone. That's where Walsh ultimately fails. Not because he loses an argument, but because his vision of America only works if certain people are never allowed to belong.